stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, her long gray coat fluttering in the wind. The sea below roared with ancient power, waves smashing against the stone. For over 30 years, she had lived in the small coastal village of Alden Ridge. Most people saw her as the quiet librarian with a distant look in her eyes. But Eleanor had once dreamed of more than dusty books and stormy coastlines. She had dreamed of music halls and moonlight dances in Paris, of voices singing her name from velvet balconies. Now her only audience was the gulls, her only applause the howling wind. The years had taught her silence, but not surrender. Each morning she lit the candle in her window, a beacon not just for lost sailors, but for herself, a reminder that hope, like the tide, always returns. She often wondered if it was too late to change the story, if life had passed her by without mercy. But something inside her still burned, quietly, stubbornly. A little flame, waiting for the right gust to rise again. That morning, as the mist parted, she made a decision, one that would change everything. Because stories, after all, are not only for the young. Back in the village, life moved in familiar rhythms. Children ran to school with wet boots and sleepy eyes. Fishermen mended their nets in the morning fog. The bakery filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. And Eleanor, as always, opened the library at 9. It was a small place, 2 rooms and a fireplace. The books had been donated by villagers over the years. Some pages were torn, some stories unfinished. But the library had become a sanctuary, a place where dreams slept on shelves, waiting. Eleanor knew every title by heart. She whispered them like old friends. The Secret Garden, Great Expectations, Jane Eyre. Each book carried a part of her youth, but one in particular sat on her desk, a worn journal. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellow. Inside were words she had once written, lyrics, poems, ideas for songs, remnants of the life she had once pursued, and now perhaps would chase once more. That evening, Eleanor locked the library and walked home slowly. The sky was bruised with streaks of purple and gold. She paused by the harbor, watching the boats sway. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the journal. "I've waited long enough," she whispered. Her voice, unused to daring, cracked in the cold air. At home, she placed the journal on the kitchen table, lit a candle, made a pot of tea. Then, as if waking from a long sleep, she began to write. The words came cautiously at first, like frightened birds, then faster, flowing from her hand like rain on glass. She wrote until the candle had burned low, until the world outside was swallowed in darkness. Memories came alive in her mind. A piano beneath her fingers, a stage lit in amber, a young man with a guitar and laughter in his eyes. Regret sat beside her, but so did something else. Possibility. That night, Eleanor didn't just remember who she was. She reclaimed her. The next morning, Eleanor walked to the village cafe. It was a modest place run by Marta, a widow from Spain. They had shared quiet coffees for years, but little carried her journal with her. Marta raised an eyebrow when she saw it. "New book?" she asked with a curious smile. "Old dreams," Eleanor replied, setting it down. She opened to a page and let Marta read. The cafe fell silent as Marta read the lyrics. After a long pause, she looked up, her eyes shining. "You must show this to Daniel," she said. Eleanor hesitated. Daniel was Marta's son, a music teacher in the city. He visited rarely, but always brought his guitar. Eleanor had heard him play once, years ago. His music had awakened something in her then. Now it might bring it fully to life. Would he even care? Eleanor asked softly. Marta only smiled. "Dreams never die," she said. "They just wait for a melody." Daniel arrived that weekend, unaware of what awaited him. He was tall, soft-spoken, and wore his guitar like armor. Marta handed him Eleanor's journal without a word. He read for over an hour, completely still. Then he looked up and said, "These are songs." Eleanor laughed nervously. "They're just words." "No," he insisted. "They're music." That afternoon, he brought out his guitar. "Let's see what happens," he said gently. Eleanor's hands shook as she turned a page. She sang the first lines in a trembling voice. The notes rose uncertain, but grew stronger. Daniel played softly, letting the lyrics lead. Something magical happened in that small kitchen. 2 generations, 2 dreams, 1 song. They played until the sky darkened. When the final chord faded, Eleanor was crying. Not from sadness, but from rediscovery. Something she thought had died was alive again, and it was only the beginning. The following week, Eleanor and Daniel met every evening. He would arrive with his guitar, she with her journal. They sat by the window, where the candle always flickered. Each session brought out more songs, more confidence. They laughed at Eleanor's rhymes, cried at her melodies. Daniel recorded their sessions on his phone, just in case. He spoke of open mic nights, of local radio. Eleanor waved the ideas away with nervous hands. "I'm too old," she said. "You're timeless," he replied. Her neighbors started to notice her change. She walked with more energy, eyes brighter. At the market, she hummed as she picked apples. At the library, she reorganized the poetry section. She even brought fresh flowers to the front desk. Eleanor had begun to glow from within. It was as if the lighthouse in her soul had been relit. People whispered, wondering what had changed. She only smiled and said, "I remembered something important." But the truth was, she had remembered herself. In late autumn, the village hosted its annual harvest festival. It was a night of music, food, and dancing. Daniel suggested they perform one of their songs. Eleanor turned pale at the idea. "Sing, in front of everyone." He nodded gently. "It's your story. They need to hear it." She spent the next few days in silent thought. Each night she stared at her reflection, unsure. The mirror showed an older woman, yes, but also one with fire in her eyes. On the night of the festival, she wore a blue scarf, the same one she'd worn the day she left for Paris. Her hands trembled, but her heart beat steadily. Daniel stood beside her on stage, tuning his guitar. The crowd buzzed with curiosity. Eleanor took the microphone with both hands. The lights were blinding, but comforting, like the sun after a storm. And when the first note played, she began to sing. Her voice, though aged, filled the night like a prayer. The crowd was silent at first, caught off guard. Then the melody pulled them in, one by one. Eleanor sang of lost dreams and found courage, of moonlit hopes and the passing of time. Her voice cracked but did not falter. Children leaned against their parents, listening. Old friends exchanged glances, eyes glistening. When she finished, the silence lingered. Then came the applause, loud, unending, real. Eleanor stood frozen, overwhelmed. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he whispered. She looked out at the cheering faces, at Marta clapping with tears in her eyes, at the mayor who stood applauding with both hands. Even the shy baker was smiling. Eleanor bowed once, then again, and for the first time in decades, she felt whole. Not for what she had done, but for who she had become. The night was no longer cold, it was full of light. After the festival, everything began to shift. People came to the library not just for books. They came to ask about her songs, her process. Eleanor began hosting poetry evenings by the fire. She invited young musicians to play, to dream. The library, once quiet, echoed with stories and song. Daniel uploaded their songs online. Within weeks, they had a small but devoted following. An indie label reached out, offering to help record. Eleanor laughed when she read the email. "Imagine that," she told Marta, "a record deal at 70. Marta only replied, "Age is a number. Passion is forever." Eleanor accepted, not for fame, but for the message. Her music wasn't about stardom. It was about truth, about finding your voice no matter when. She recorded the album in a local studio. Daniel produced, gently guiding each note. When it was done, they called it Waves of Light, a tribute to the sea and to her. A story told through sound, stitched in courage. The release of Waves of Light brought a quiet storm. Radio stations picked up her songs, surprised by the emotion. Reviewers called it haunting, authentic, a voice reborn. Eleanor read the praise with disbelief. "I never expected anyone to care," she admitted to Daniel. "But you cared," he reminded her, "and that's where it starts." She began receiving letters, some from nearby towns, others from far-off places. Canada, Brazil, Japan. People wrote to say her music had moved them, that her lyrics gave them strength during chemotherapy, during divorce, during long nights of loneliness. Eleanor cried as she read each one, not from sadness, but from understanding. They had all walked through shadows, just like her. Now, together, they found light in the music. She answered every letter by hand, sometimes with advice, sometimes with a lyric, and always with hope The woman who had once felt invisible had become a beacon for others. But with attention came questions from her past. One day, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a photograph, faded but familiar. A man with a guitar, laughing under Paris lights. Her hands trembled as she turned the picture over. In neat handwriting, still listening, always was. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Andre, the musician she had loved long ago, the one she left behind when she returned to Alden Ridge. She hadn't heard from him in over 40 years. They had parted with promises, never fulfilled. Life and its rush had swept them into different tides. She wrote back immediately, but there was no address, only hope and silence. Still, she placed the photo by her bedside, and every time she sang, she imagined he heard. Perhaps across a radio, perhaps in memory. Some connections, she knew, never truly faded, like songs written on the soul. One rainy afternoon, a stranger walked into the library. He wore a black coat soaked from the storm. Eleanor looked up from her desk, surprised. The man removed his hat and smiled gently. "I'm looking for a story," he said. His voice was older, but familiar. It was Andre. Years had passed, but the eyes were the same. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then, without a word, she embraced him. He held her tightly, whispering, "You found your song, and you found your way back," she replied. They sat by the fireplace, two souls reunited. He had followed her music online. Each lyric had pulled him closer. "I never stopped playing," he confessed. "And I never stopped waiting," she admitted. They spoke until the rain stopped, until the past felt like a bridge, not a burden. And for the first time in decades, Eleanor felt young again. Andre stayed in Alden Ridge through the winter. He played guitar at the library concerts. Children sat on the floor, mesmerized by their harmony. Eleanor's songs grew richer, fuller, with him beside her. Together they wrote new melodies in the mornings. In the evenings they walked by the sea. She showed him the cliffs where she once stood alone. He showed her chords he had carried for years. They spoke of what had been lost and what had finally been found. They never married, never needed to. Their bond was deeper than vows. It was in the music, in the laughter, in the silence. The villagers came to love Andre quickly. He helped repair boats, played at weddings, and in every corner of the town, their songs echoed, not just as music, but as memory, as proof that it is never too late, that love, like song, can return on the wind. Spring brought a national invitation. A music foundation wanted to honor Eleanor's story. They invited her to speak, to perform in the capital. She hesitated, unsure of the grandeur, but Daniel and Andre encouraged her. "Your voice lit the way for others," Daniel said. She packed her journal, her blue scarf, and courage. The hall was grand, velvet chairs and golden lights. Her heart raced as she walked on stage. Thousands of faces, waiting. She took a breath and began to speak, not about fame or fortune, but about fear and faith, about waiting, about daring, about singing at 70. Her words resonated with everyone, young, old, lost, dreaming. Then she sang, and the hall rose in standing ovation. Some cried, others closed their eyes. Eleanor smiled, not for the applause, but for the music she finally shared. The return to Alden Ridge felt softer now. The streets welcomed her with blooming cherry trees. Children ran past her, humming her songs. The librarian's desk overflowed with new poetry. People left notes tucked into books. Thank you. She placed each one in a wooden box labeled gratitude. Eleanor resumed her quiet mornings, tea in hand. Andre played in the background, gentle as spring rain. Some days they spoke little, content in the quiet. Other days were filled with ideas and melodies. Daniel visited often, always with questions and jokes. He brought new musicians to learn from her. Eleanor became a mentor without trying. She taught them not just technique, but truth. Sing what you've lived, she told them. And if you haven't lived it, listen until you understand. The library became a sanctuary for seekers of rhythm, of purpose, of belonging. And in that old brick building, a revolution of hearts took place, one verse at a time. One evening, Eleanor sat alone by the sea. The sky blushed with sunset hues. She opened her journal, pages fluttering in the breeze. It was nearly full. Poems, lyrics, confessions. Every word traced her journey from silence to song. She remembered the night she almost gave up. How darkness had once felt so permanent. Now even the shadows sang. She looked up and saw Andre approaching. He carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate. They sat together, watching the tide roll in. Do you ever wish things had happened sooner? He asked. She considered it carefully. No, she said. Some flowers bloom in winter. He smiled, touched her hand, and what beautiful blooms they are. They watched the moon rise in silence. No regrets, no longing, just presence. The kind that only comes from surviving the storm and learning to dance in the rain. In the following months, life settled into a quiet rhythm. Eleanor recorded a second album, Echoes of the Tide. It included collaborations with local youth. She made space for their voices, their stories, and in doing so, she found even more of her own. The album charted modestly, but hearts responded deeply. She received more letters now from young girls. I want to be brave like you. I thought it was too late for me. You taught me that starting over is possible. She read each one with reverence. Every sentence was a thread in her tapestry. She never took it for granted. Eleanor knew fame was a wave, passing, fleeting, but impact, real, soul-touching impact, was different. That stayed. It lived on in memories, in voices, in courage. And as long as one person dared to sing, her song would never end. It would echo like the tide without end. Eventually, the world quieted again. The letters slowed, the interviews faded, but in Alden Ridge, the music never stopped. Eleanor continued her library gatherings. She read poetry to toddlers every Friday. She taught songwriting on Thursdays to to teens. Andre painted, now inspired by her words. Their home was filled with canvases and chords. The walls pulsed with color and rhythm. Visitors often remarked it felt like walking into a dream. One day, Daniel arrived with news. A filmmaker wanted to create a documentary about Eleanor's journey, her music, her rediscovery. She chuckled at the idea. But I'm just a librarian who sings. Exactly, Daniel said. That's what makes it powerful. Filming began that summer. Old neighbors told stories. Young singers performed her songs. And Eleanor, always humble, offered her truth. Softly, honestly, with grace. The documentary premiered the following year. It was called The Library of Songs. Audiences across the country were moved, not by glamour, but by quiet resilience, by the beauty of beginning again. Eleanor watched it beside Andre and Daniel. She wept softly as her younger self appeared on screen. The silent woman staring at a bookshelf, the trembling voice behind the microphone, the blossoming artist under the library lights. The crowd stood in ovation as the credits rolled. She didn't wave or speak that night. She just held Andre's hand. He whispered, "You told the story only you could tell." And that was enough. Not for attention, but for completion. She had placed her truth into the world, and like a song carried by the wind, it found its way to waiting hearts. The echo would live on. Years passed gently, like pages turning. Eleanor's hair turned silver, then snowy white. Andre's hands grew slower, but still strummed each morning. They aged not in silence, but in harmony. Every wrinkle a lyric, every day a new stanza. She spent her time tending the garden, reading poetry, sharing tea with friends. The library named a wing after her, the Eleanor Hall of Music and Memory. Inside were handwritten lyrics, old guitars, and recorded tapes. Children visited on field trips, wide-eyed and full of questions. She always smiled and said, "Sing what's real." And they did. Her presence became less frequent, but her spirit never faded. Even on quiet days, one could feel her there. In the sunlight through stained glass, in the melody between shelves. When Andre passed peacefully one winter morning, Eleanor grieved with both sorrow and gratitude. He had been her mirror, her melody, her muse. She wrote a song titled "Until the Quiet." It became her most beloved piece, not because it topped charts, but because it captured farewell and forever. Her voice, aged but warm, trembled with grace. She sang it once at his memorial, then never again. The villagers played it each year by the sea, and those who listened felt the love between the notes. Eleanor continued quietly for a while, smiling, humming, writing. She spoke less, dreamed more, until one soft spring morning she closed her eyes in her favorite chair. A book in her lap, a song in her heart, and like the last page of a well-loved story, she slipped gently into peace. At her farewell, the entire village gathered. Children released lanterns into the twilight. Each one carried a lyric she had written. The library's garden was filled with music